On December 10, 1941, the contradiction was stark. Britain had sent HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse into waters threatened by Japanese aircraft, yet when the attack came, there was no reliable fighter cover over them. These were not obsolete ships left behind by events. One was a new battleship, the other an experienced battle cruiser, and together they carried the prestige of the Royal Navy into the South China Sea. The shock was not that aircraft could strike at sea. By late 1941, that danger was already understood. The shock was that a British force had still been committed under conditions in which speed, surprise, and seamanship were expected to make up for a shortage that could not really be made up at all. Within hours, Japanese reconnaissance found the force, shadowed it, and brought in the torpedo bombers and high-level attackers that sank both capital ships. The disaster off Malaya was sudden, but the assumptions behind it had been forming for years. Force Z left Singapore on the evening of December 8, 1941. Its core was clear and small: HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Repulse, and 4 destroyers. The immediate purpose was also clear enough. Japan had opened its offensive across the region, and British commanders hoped a fast surface force might interfere with landings or threaten invasion convoys moving toward Malaya. That idea had a long pedigree in British planning. A powerful squadron based at Singapore was supposed to deter aggression, or at least complicate it. In practice, what sailed with Admiral Sir Tom Phillips was not the large fleet once imagined for the Far East, but a compact striking force sent into a theater where the air balance was already unfavorable. There was an obvious absence. No carrier accompanied them. The carrier intended for the wider deployment, HMS Indomitable, was not there. That left any sortie dependent on land-based air support from Malaya, and British Malaya by December 1941 was already short of aircraft on a serious scale. Planners had long judged that more were needed than were actually available. So the mission was built on a narrow margin from the start. A surface squadron could still be dangerous, especially against transports, especially if it arrived unexpectedly, especially at night or in bad weather. But all of that assumed the ships could avoid sustained daytime attack from the air. Phillips did not sail in ignorance of the air question. He requested reconnaissance and fighter cover for the operation. The answer from RAF Command in Malaya was that fighter protection could not be provided. That is the hard fact at the center of the episode. The sortie was not launched because everyone believed air cover existed. It was launched, although reliable air cover did not. This matters because it changes the tone of the story. The issue was not a simple administrative slip in which someone forgot to ask for fighters. The request was made. The shortage was known. Yet the force sailed anyway, because the pressure to act was immediate and because inaction carried its own dangers. If Japanese convoys established themselves on the Malayan coast without naval interference, Britain risked conceding the initiative in the very opening days of the campaign. That was the wager. A fast naval blow delivered before Japanese air power could be concentrated on the ships. It was a gamble framed by urgency, by weak air resources, and by the lingering belief that heavy ships, properly handled, still had room to operate in contested waters. It is easy, after the loss, to turn Phillips into either a reckless romantic or a helpless victim of circumstance. Neither version is quite satisfactory. What can be said with confidence is narrower and more useful. Phillips' new fighter cover was not reliably available. He still chose to proceed. Contemporary records and later histories strongly suggest that he expected speed, surprise, and offensive movement to reduce the risk. even if they could not remove it. That is not the same as saying he welcomed the danger, or that he believed aircraft were irrelevant. It means he appears to have judged that waiting might forfeit the only chance to strike. There was a practical logic to this. Surface ships could move at once. Landings had to be intercepted before they were firmly established. Reports in the opening days of the campaign were confused. The geography of the South China Sea and the eastern coast of Malaya offered room for a force to maneuver, and night action still seemed to promise opportunities to a navy trained to think in those terms. But the British reading of the air threat was weaker than it needed to be. Historians differ on how far the underestimation went and who shared it most fully. What the evidence does support is a broader conclusion. British planners had not fully appreciated the practical reach and effectiveness of Japanese air power in this theater, even though they already knew Malaya's air defenses were thin. That distinction matters. They did not think air attack was impossible. They misjudged what would happen when modern, well-flown aircraft found major warships at sea without dependable fighter protection. The danger was acknowledged in general, but not absorbed in operational terms. The result was a command decision shaped by several pressures at once. London wanted visible naval resistance in the Far East. Singapore could not offer the air umbrella such a force really required. Phillips had ships in hand, but not the supporting system that would have made them much safer to use. Once war had begun, the temptation to use the force immediately was intense. There is also a revealing irony in the composition of Force Z itself. Prince of Wales was one of the Royal Navy's newest battleships, equipped with modern fire control and heavy anti-aircraft armament. Repulse, though older, was fast. These were not vessels expected to be helpless. That technical confidence, however understandable, may have made the operational compromise seem less extreme than it was. In this sense, the sortie belonged to an awkward historical moment. Naval officers were not blind to aviation, but many still believed that bold handling, ship speed, anti-aircraft guns, and dispersal at sea could keep capital ships alive long enough to do their work. Off Malaya, that belief was about to be tested under the worst conditions. The operational hope behind the sortie began to unravel once Japanese reconnaissance found the ships. Force Z was sighted and shadowed before the main attack developed. From that moment, the British force was no longer an elusive striking group looking for transports. It had become a target. That change was decisive because the missing element could no longer be improvised. A battleship can maneuver. A destroyer can lay smoke. A formation can turn into torpedo tracks and throw up anti-aircraft fire. What it cannot do, once located in daylight, is create its own fighter screen. The Japanese attacks on December 10th were the practical answer to the question Phillips had accepted when he sailed. Aircraft came in against ships at sea, not trapped in harbor, not at anchor, but underway and maneuvering. Repulse famously handled some of the early attacks with great skill, avoiding several torpedoes. That fact is worth holding on to because it prevents the story from sliding into mechanical inevitability. Good seamanship still mattered. It simply was not enough. Prince of Wales then suffered a torpedo hit that caused severe damage and sharply reduced her fighting efficiency. With one capital ship crippled and the other repeatedly attacked, the formation's room for survival narrowed quickly. Japanese aircraft pressed home the advantage. By the end of the action, both Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk. The speed of the destruction impressed contemporaries almost as much as the losses themselves. These were frontline capital ships. They had not been destroyed by an enemy battle fleet. They had been overwhelmed from the air in open water. This was the first time in the Pacific War that Allied capital ships were sunk at sea by air attack. That gave the event a significance larger than the tactical result of one failed sortie. It announced, with brutal clarity, that even powerful and modern surface units could not count on freedom of action where hostile aircraft could find them and friendly fighters could not shield them. Rescue work by the destroyers saved many survivors, but the command loss was severe. Admiral Phillips was dead, along with Captain Leach of Prince of Wales and Captain Tennant of Repulse's long professional circle, deprived of its ship. The human scale of the sinking should not be lost behind the doctrinal lesson. A theory of risk had been applied in wartime, and men paid for it in the water off Malaya. Could the loss have been avoided? Only with caution can that be answered. Some alternatives are easy to name. Phillips might have delayed the sortie. He might have remained closer to stronger defensive cover. The force might have been used more conservatively until better coordination with the RAF was possible. In theory, any of those choices would have reduced the chance of meeting Japanese aircraft alone in daylight. Yet each alternative had a cost visible at the time, not just in hindsight. Delay might mean missing the convoys entirely. A force kept close to Singapore was a fleeting being, but not an active obstacle to landings. Better air cover was highly desirable, but the regional shortage was real. This was not a theater where commanders could simply summon a robust fighter umbrella because they preferred one. That is why the most serious explanation lies above any single moment of choice. Britain entered the Pacific War in the Far East with a surface force meant to signal strength, but without the full system required to protect and employ that force properly. The gap between symbol and support was dangerous. Once operations began, commanders had to act inside it. Phillips bears responsibility for taking the force out under those conditions. That cannot be avoided, but it would be too simple to stop there. He operated within a wider structure that had accepted severe air weakness in Malaya, had not fully absorbed the operational consequences of Japanese air power, and still hoped capital ships could exert pressure by speed and offensive intent. The sinking of Force Z therefore stands as both a battlefield event and a warning delivered at once. It did not prove that battleships had become useless in every role. It proved something narrower and more devastating. In contested airspace, without effective fighter cover or air superiority, even the best heavy ships could be hunted down and destroyed. That lesson was not entirely new in December 1941. But off Malaya, it was made impossible to evade. Britain had sent 2 major ships to sea because the situation seemed too urgent for caution, and because older naval instincts still shaped what caution meant. The result was that Force Z became one of the clearest early demonstrations of how Pacific War would punish half measures between sea power and air power. Force Z was not sacrificed because Britain had never heard the message of air power. The tragedy is sharper than that. British commanders had heard it, but not fully enough, and not in a form that had yet displaced older habits of naval action. On December 8, 1941, they sent Prince of Wales and Repulse from Singapore with 4 destroyers, asked for fighter cover, learned that it could not be reliably provided, and sailed anyway. 2 days later, the consequences were lying under the South China Sea. The loss became one of the defining warnings of the early Pacific War. Prestige, armor, heavy guns, and ship speed could not compensate for the absence of command of the air. Off Malaya, the Royal Navy discovered that fact not in theory, but in action. Subscribe for more hidden stories and fatal decisions that changed history.